What I'm going to be doing is stepping through Rig Veda 7.18, that is the Battle of 10 Kings hymn, along with Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, and showing how not only do they tell of essentially the same mythical event, the waters becoming dry, becoming shallow enough to cross so that, the protagonist group can pass through, and then the god being called on, and he causes the pursuing enemies to be drowned by those waters that have been crossed. All of that, not only do both of these hymns tell this same fairly unique, or even, very unique with all of the specific details, events, not only that, but they develop their imagery and theme in approximately the same order of the organization within the hymn itself, so that you can see some of the very same moments in both kind of happening in approximately the same sequence. So I want to show this visually so you know what I mean when I say these hymns are telling the same set of details, set of images in the same order. When I say the same, I mean this approximately the same. So you can see for yourself, I've color coded where in both hymns they're doing approximately the same thing, same part of the development of the hymn. So for example, the pink here is the intro for both. As you can see, the Vedic hymn is consistently longer, more wordy, more imagery happening, which seems to be shortened in the Exodus version. So I'm arguing that this is the adaptation into Exodus is a kind of shortening and summarization. I'm cutting away a lot of the extraneous Vedic elaborations, things that wouldn't have been pertinent to them, to make the version found in Exodus. But that this is showing a direct process of adaptation. Now, there's also a debate whether this shows adaptation or whether it just shows that these definitely came from a shared source. So we'll hopefully go into that a bit after I've walked through the parallel. So you can see if we zoom in here, that this intro material for the Rig Vedic hymn, Battle of the 10 Kings, it begins with talking to Indra, the god, and calling him the god of our fathers. That's the first thing that is said. And then some praise of Indra throughout, describing him as a king and a herdsman in elaborate ways. And then concluding with invoking him as our shelter. Might we be in your good thought, Indra, in your shelter. So the main details here are that this intro invokes the god as the god of our fathers. And that happens to be exactly what the Exodus hymn opens with, saying, I will sing to the Lord, he is my father's God, in verse 2, and my defense, or my strength, or so that word for defense is translated differently. But this is just to give an overview, a bird's eye view of what I'm talking about when I make these parallels. So that intro is shorter, but is hitting the same opening points, which are not in every hymn that you read. You do not see an invocation of the God as the God of our fathers, except in certain hymns. It's not ubiquitous. And then the main theme gets developed in the green section. The floods that had spread out, Indra made them into fords easy to cross for Sudas. Whereas the theme gets developed in the green over here in the Exodus. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea, the best of Pharaoh's officers, both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. So that is the theme of the waters being dried, and then the pursuers, as we see in the Vedic hymn, further down is where the pursuing enemies get covered with the waters, as in the Exodus one. And then one of the key things is that in the yellow section here, number 3, we have a direct quotation of the pursuing enemies speaking. And what they're doing is approximately the same in both cases. This happens, as you see, we have the intro material invoking God of the Father. Then we have some developing of what's happening, the plot, like I said, the waters being made dry and then crushing the enemy. And then right in there, in the midst of that theme, that plot being developed, the pursuing enemies then speak. And what they speak is a quotation, and it is saying very similar things about how they're pursuing for plunder, how they are pursuing greedily as plunderers, as in the Exodus version, the enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them, I will draw my sword and my hand will destroy them. So this is just a bird's eye view, and then I will try to walk through all of the key points in this order. And after all of those similarities we have in the blue section, what you could call the keystone metaphor within the hymn, which refers to the god destroying, it's called wetting down in the Vedic version, cutting the enemies down like they are grass, and also calling him a wonderworker. This is exactly the keystone metaphor of the Exodus hymn, which is that in the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you, you unleashed your burning anger and consumed them like stubble or straw. Stubble is referring to a kind of chaff, some kind of very similar imagery to cutting grass. This is consuming them like they are stubble, and also calling him a wonder worker, working wonders. So those are the keystone things. After that specific sequence of things, the latter half of the hymns go into naming specific enemies and tribes that the god has destroyed or thrown down, very similar in this sort of conclusion. So the main plot has been laid out, and then it goes into a similar grouping. It just happens to go into this sequence of talking about the god who has thrown down a sequence of enemies specifically, and referring to the special bond between the protagonist tribe with their god, their friendship or chosenness, as we'll see. So if we can walk through this, I can give a bit more detail. So the context for this comparison is crucial, because not only is this a very detailed and precise parallel, but it happens within a shared uncanny set of motifs, a shared mythos that is hard to explain away. What I mean by this is we have in the Vedic version the poet sage who is invoking Indra to cause the waters to dry up and then collapse over the pursuing enemies is called Vasishta. So Vasishta and god Indra cause the parting and collapse of waters. That is in this hymn, Rig Veda 7.18. Vasishta's rival Visvamitra curses the Saraswati river to turn to blood during their ongoing feud in the Mahabharata version. So that is a later continuation of this mythos of Vasishta and Vishvamitra, these two rival sages found in the Mahabharata. So in this same extended mythos of Vasishta and Vishvamitra, there is this parting and collapse of waters and the turning of the waters to blood in a similar scene. Along with that, we have Vishvamitra uses a demon to possess the king and then to kill the 100 sons of that Vasishta. So killing the large number of the opponent's sons using a demon as this go-between. This killing of a huge number of sons is also triggered when Vasishta's son is unjustly whipped by the king and retaliates on him with a curse. So not only all of this, but it's this very similar scene to when Moses sees the Hebrew being unjustly treated or hit, and he then retaliates by killing the Egyptian and has to run away to Midian for a time. And that triggers the later confrontation where, for example, the firstborn sons are all killed of the opponent. In this story, we have a similar scene where the son of Vasishta is meditating in the forest and he gets unjustly whipped by the king himself, and he retaliates by cursing the king, and this triggers Vishvamitra, who is the priest of the king, to then retaliate upon Vasishta and his family by killing their 100 sons with a demon. So obviously there's some different elements there, but it's this cluster of uncanny things which are hard to explain away. That it gives reason to look closely at this hymn. So that is what we will do right here. So this Rig Veda 7.18, the parting and collapsing of the waters event. It is called the most prominent historical event recorded in the Rig Veda, the Battle of the Ten Kings by Michael Witzel, who is one of the most prominent scholars, most respected Vedic scholars and comparative mythology scholars in the world today. This is a battle which Witzel says, quote, "The Bharatas won by breaking a natural dike on the river." So one interesting point here is that this event in the Vedic hymn is not explicitly over supernatural. It is attributed to the act of Indra and his doing, but it is not some impossibly supernatural, unnatural thing. Whereas in the Exodus hymn, it is rather more exaggerated, more supernatural. If we take the interpretation of, the waters becoming like a wall, like an insane magical wall, or two walls of water, that's an intensification of the imagery. Whereas in the Vedic hymn, there are hints that what has happened is some kind of natural crashing back of the waters that were shallow and made fordable. So they come to a river that has been, they've been blessed by Indra's blessing that the waters are made shallow and fordable for them. And then during the chaos of crossing and battling, scholars think that either a natural dike has been broken to cause the waters to crash back down, or there are so many bodies in the waters that they cause some kind of diverting of waters. Some event has happened, apparently, that has caused the waters to crash back down and to victoriously drown the pursuing enemies. Okay, so Jameson and Brereton, the translators of the Rig Veda from 2014, also some of the most prominent Vedic scholars alive, say, quote, "The Parushni River, whose course seems to have been diverted during the battle and in which a number of the combatants seem to have drowned." So sort of a straightforward way of describing what the hymn is suggesting has happened. So this Rig Veda Parting of the Waters event involving Vasishta, who has just replaced Vishvamitra in the Rig Veda, in this Rig Vedic event, lays the groundwork for the rivalry of Vasishta and Vishvamitra that we see told more about in that Mahabharata story that I described, with the waters turning to blood and the sons being killed in retaliation by a demon. That being where the sacred river is turned to blood, etc. We have in the Rig Veda, specific books of the Rig Veda are attributed to certain rishis and their families, like their clans of poets who have composed these hymns. Traditionally, they are seen as the actual composers of the hymns. Book 7 is attributed to Vasishta and his family, but Book 3 is attributed to Vishvamitra mainly, Vishvamitra, who becomes his rival. So they are both sages who are named as composers of books of the Rig Veda. That is one factor that suggests they had a historical kernel. And in these books, for example, in Book 3, Vishvamitra is praising Sudas, even for doing things like crossing rivers in more mundane ways, certain mundane events at certain times. It seems that Vishvamitra was indeed King Sudas's poet sage, his rishi, his purohita. And we can see that in the battle in Book 7, which belongs to Vasishta, that somehow Vasishta has taken over the job of the purohita, priest, and poet for Sudas in this battle. So those are historical points. So why this one book attributed to Vishvamitra actually has him praising this king and doing sort of mundane events like crossing other rivers and things. And then we have this dramatic turning point in Book 7 attributed to Vasishta, and he is now the one who is the praiser of Sudas and not Vishvamitra anymore. So what seems to have happened, what scholars have extrapolated, is that Vishvamitra was ousted as the priest poet at this point, and that not only that, but Vasishta, the new poet, has, with Sudas, they have broken away from their Puru overtribe and fought this battle against them. So they're a breakaway, smaller group. They're just the group of Sudas and his allies. They are fighting against the 10 kings, which are the Puru alliance. And what happens is that they are victorious, of course. They are the Bharatas, where the name Mahabharata comes from later. But they become dominant for a time, and then when they move into the Saraswati, the kingdom is kind of renegotiated and reconsolidated, and the defeated parties aren't entirely eliminated. Things get reintegrated in a complex way after that. But the point is, there are these historical touch points where we can see in the hymns, in the books of the hymns themselves, the change of who is the poet of this king, Sudas, dramatically happening in the hymns themselves. And so for this reason, some scholars such as Witzel think that the opponent priest in Rig Veda 7.18 is actually Vishvamitra himself. Witzel and Schmidt both believe that to be the case. It's not stated who the rival priest is, only that Vasishta is the protagonist priest on the side of Sudas. But nonetheless, there is this possibility that this hymn is a depiction of this rivalry between Vasishta and Vishvamitra. It seems to be part of that developing mythos of they were rivals. One was ousted by Sudas to be replaced with the other, who then fought and won this battle on this river. And Jameson and Brereton, or Jameson at least, says she is agnostic about whether the rival priest in Rig Veda 7.18 actually is Vishvamitra or not, because it's not stated. She remains agnostic, but it is something to keep in mind when in verse 5 of this hymn, the rival priest is said to be sort of shouting imprecations, which are like curses, at the fury of the river. That's similar to Vishvamitra cursing the Saraswati to turn to blood later when he's pursuing Vasishta, and Vasishta escapes across it with its help. Okay, if that makes sense. So with that context, let's go into the specific points, because there are, as I described, there is almost the same sequence of unfolding details in both of these hymns. So number one, and as we see here, the asterisk denotes the most important, crucial parallels, in my opinion. So even if you think some of these are a little bit loose or not convincing, please pay most attention to the ones that have an asterisk. And those are the anchor points, which I think are very uncanny and undeniable. So number one is that intro material, which specifically invokes the god of the fathers. In Rig Veda 7.18, we have, "With you beside them, our fathers also won," etc. And then some elaborate praising of Indra right after that. In Exodus 15, we have, quote, "My father's God, and I will exalt him." So this combination of the father's God and the exaltation or praise of that God. Number two, in that intro as well, in that same intro group of text, the God is invoked as shelter in one case and as strength in the other. So similar, but not quite exactly the same concept. So in the Vedic version, "Might we be in your good thought, Indra, in your shelter." So it's a very specific thing they ask for at the conclusion of the intro. In the Exodus hymn, we have, "The Lord is my strength and my..." Oh, sorry, that's a typo, apologies. But "The Lord is my strength / song / defense." So it's this word Zimrat, and it says from Scott Nogle's article on this very topic, Hidden Waters, it says, "The meaning of Zimrat depends on whether one reads it as DMR, strength, or PS, ZMR." So DMR or ZMR. So the meaning of this word in the Exodus hymn is debated whether it means strength or song, right? But it is this similar concept of invoking the god as something comparable here, okay? Also, in the intro of the Vedic one, "Everyone says that you alone are my herdsman." And okay, so Sharman is the word for your shelter. For when they invoke him as shelter, is this word Sharman, which means protection, protective covering, refuge, or joy. Okay, so number three, right at the end of the intro, it says something similar to, "I sing to the god." So in the Vedic version, quote, "These gladdening hymns contending with each other, here seeking the gods, have reverently approached you." Then the poet himself speaks, "I, Vasishta, have dispatched sacred formulations," that is the word for hymns, "to you." And the word is like Brahman, so the sacred formulations. And in the Exodus version, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously." So the same combination of these sort of three concepts. He is the Father's God. I invoke him as my strength or protection or something related. And then finally concluding, "I, the poet, sing to you directly to the God, sing my hymn or my song." So then it comes to number four, the main event. This uncanny event that the whole hymn centers around is approximately very close to the same thing. So in the Vedic hymn, we have, "Even the floods that had spread out, Indra made them into fords easy to cross for Sudas." So that is this image of the waters of the river being made into shallow fords that they can cross. It is not said to be perfectly dry land, but fords. Okay, so it is crossable now. It is a significant change. It's been made into shallowly crossable fords. In the Exodus version, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Okay, so fords versus on dry ground, but the same thing essentially is happening. Number 5, the enemies then pursue through these cleared waters, and the waters collapse and drown the enemies. Here they are also depicted as confused, specifically, the enemies are. So, quote from the Vedic, he, Indra, made him into flotsam of the rivers. That is the enemy he's referring to. Made the enemy Turvasha Yaksu was himself the offering cake. And that is an image of the enemy Turvasha Yaksu being covered in waters like he's a sacrifice, an offering cake. And then it says, wedded down in their quest for wealth, like fish in water. Another image of them being struck down by the waters and drowned, wedded down. And then the ill-intentioned ones, without insight, causing Aditi to abort, diverted the course of the river Parushni. So this is that image of the river being diverted, and they are in the confusion of the enemies. Something has caused the river to divert and thus to drown them as described. In the Exodus version, we have, you blew with the wind. The sea covered them. That's from Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea. But then also in Exodus 14, the description of events that immediately comes before Song of the Sea, we have the Lord threw the Egyptian army into a panic. So they are depicted in this similar way as in a kind of confusion. The enemy is. The enemy has been made confused or panicked leading up to their destruction. Very same depiction. But that is also across into Exodus 14. So number 6, the enemy is depicted as some kind of sinking object. And this is not exactly the same, but it's a general idea, a general image. So in the Vedic, Simu, he made him into the flotsam of the rivers. The translation of flotsam there is used by a couple of different scholars, including it's in the Jameson and Brereton version, but it is somehow implied by the verbs rather than an actual noun, I think, is the way I understand it. So it doesn't literally say flotsam in this version. So that's why this one has an asterisk next to it, just to note. But it is some kind of verb description of something like this happening where they're being treated like flotsam, made into flotsam. In the Exodus version, they went down into the depths like a stone. And again, this is a rather generic concept that they've been drowned like a stone or something, okay? So number 7, the enemy falls down in the water like a motionless thing. Again, a continuation of that sort of generic idea of what happens when someone is drowned in water. In the Vedic version, quote, Turvasa Yaksu, the sacrificer, he was himself the offering cake. Again, as I said, the offering cake is this sinking object that he's been made into. And then, quote, the poet lay there, being perceived as just a sacrificial animal. Similar continuation of this imagery. In the Exodus version, we just have, they sank like lead in the mighty waters. So there is divergence here of what this image is, but it is a similar concept of this inert object that they've become like as they drown in the waters. Number 8, there is this key moment after the early development of the plot theme. Then we have this moment of the direct quoted enemy speech saying very similar things. This is just an incredible this is one of the most incredible moments in this comparison, because why should they suddenly speak at this approximately same moment saying a very similar thing? So they are boasting and commenting about plunder specifically. That is their theme. And this plunder is either their own plundering or the chosen people's plundering, as they describe it. And this is followed directly by the enemy's destruction. They also announce in this speech, in this quote, that the God that they're talking about, that the God who is at play here, is fighting for the chosen tribe against themselves, that is the enemies. So they bemoan the fact that the God has turned on them and is fighting for the other side, essentially. And even, I mentioned how in one, it is talking about their own plunder, and in the other, it seems to be talking about the plunder of the protagonist chosen tribe. And that is, the syntax of the Vedic is extremely complicated in this line of the hymn, so that it's actually hard to tell who is the one referenced. So you can see some confusion even happening in the translation, perhaps because it is just incredibly densely complicated syntax about who is being referred to. Even reading that summary in English, you can tell that. But also, even though in that Vedic version, in their speech, they refer to the plunder of the other side, of the protagonists. Right before that quotation, it talks about their own desire for plunder. So it's all right there, back to back, the same elements. Both of them talk about the same idea of the plundering, the desire for plunder of the enemies as they're pursuing. And they happen to be quoting them, they happen to be talking directly right here, saying approximately that same thing. So in the Vedic, Simyu, who was vaunting himself above our newer speech. So vaunting is boasting, and his taunts too. So he's vaunting, boasting, and taunting. The Matsyas wetted down in their quest for wealth like fish in water. And so these are names of the enemy tribes, the Matsyas. The Pakthas and the Balanases spoke out, quote, the feasting companion of the Arya. And that is referring to Indra himself, as all scholars pretty much agree that this is a reference to Indra. He's called the feasting companion of the Arya, that is the Arya people. So he's their feasting companion, he is Indra. The feasting companion of the Arya, who led us hither with desire for cattle for the Tritsus, he has gone with battle against superior men. That is referring to themselves, unquote. And here, along with this, the enemies are also called the ill-intentioned ones, highlighting this greedy, ill-intentioned quality of their pursuit. So then in the Exodus hymn, we have, quote, the enemy said, or boasted, sometimes, some translations say boasted, but the word is amar. I think it can mean both. Quote, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them, unquote. So, okay, so we have a breakdown of what amar means. It is a primitive root, meaning to say, and it's used with great latitude. That means it has a lot of broad meaning. It can mean answer, appoint, avouch, bid, or boast self. And so that aligns pretty well with the concept of the boasting enemies as they're pursuing. And then in Exodus 14, we also have, quote, the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt, unquote. So that is, you have compacted there between Exodus 14 and 15, not only that the Vedic enemy tribes, they have in their quest for wealth, they had this greed for wealth, and they're pursuing and they're discussing the concept of plunder. The desire for cattle is central. But then also we have that concept of the desire for plunder of the pursuing enemies in the Exodus version, and they're boasting. And then not only that, but the direct translation of the Vedic, the final line of the Vedic is that he, Indra, has gone with battle against us. So essentially they're describing that Indra had led them there. Even the enemies, they are worshippers of Indra too. They're all a group of Vedic tribes together who are fighting each other here. So the enemies say that Indra has led us here, but he's gone with battle against us now. And that's what they specifically say. Then we just happen to have in Exodus 14, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. The same exact concept. Not only that, but that's one of the only quoted lines of Exodus 14. So that's the narrative description of what's happening right before the Song of the Sea part in the Exodus crossing of the sea story. So it just so happens that the kind of two main quotations of the speech of the Egyptians aligns perfectly with this only quotation, direct speech of what the pursuing enemy tribes say in the Vedic hymn. So I just hope people can absorb how incredible that is, and that it spreads across Exodus 14 and Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, so that it looks like even the writers, when they were writing Exodus 14, was drawing back from the same source material. They all come from one source, one way or another, however you want to break that apart. So number 9, they went foolishly into the waters and none survived. In the Vedic hymn, quote, they came to the Parushni, that's the river, to a failed end as if their real goal, not even the swift one, made it home for supper, unquote. In Exodus 14, once again, touching on the fact that this crosses not only Exodus 15, but also the material they put into Exodus 14. Quote, The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. So again, this is rather generic in a way. Not one of them made it home from supper. Not one of them survived. But it's very coincidental that it hits the same exact note in this short amount of text as this dramatic line to drop in there. And not only that, but talking about how they went into the waters to the Purushni River as a failed end, and then immediately after that, not even the swift one made it home from supper. In the Exodus one, they followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. It's this back-to-back pairing of these two sentences that are saying essentially exactly the same thing. Okay, number 10, horse and rider are propelled or thrown down into the waters and drowned together in a single haunting phrase. Again, this is an uncanny similarity of the pairing of the concepts within a phrase or a set of phrases. In the Vedic hymn, we have the Prishnigus, that's the name of one of these enemy tribes, the Prishnigus propelled down to the dappled one, and that's a sort of pun or a reference to the Purushni River itself. The Prishnigus propelled down to the dappled one, that is the river, the bottom of the river. The teams and their battlers followed orders, unquote. So the teams, meaning the teams of chariot drivers or horse riders or whatever, of teams of horsemen, and their battlers, the battlers are the riders, they followed orders. So they followed orders, meaning going down, they followed orders and ended up going down to the bottom of the river, is what it's saying. In the Griffith translation, that's the older 19th century one, but it says, quote, they who drive spotted steeds, sent down by Prishni, gave ear, the warriors and their harnessed horses, unquote. So it phrases it. That translation just happens to phrase it more like the Exodus version. So to give you the idea. In the Exodus one, of course, famously, quote, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. So it's this, to me, it's this haunting pairing of horse and rider. And we hear that echoing in our minds when we read Song of the Sea. It's one of the most famous images, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. It's very dramatic. And it's right there in its own form in the Vedic hymn, propelled down to the dappled one, the teams and their battlers followed orders. Okay, number 11, there's again an interesting line unit, meaning a couple of concepts combined back to back in a similar way. And these are majesty, a concept of the god's majesty, followed by the enemy being cast down. In the Vedic version, quote, he, Indra, who as king, that is his majesty, referring to his majesty, with desire for fame, has strewn down the 21 peoples of the two Vaikarnas, unquote. And in the Exodus hymn, quote, in the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew or threw down your adversaries. So it's this back-to-back concept of invoking the god's majesty or kingship, kingdom, and then immediately saying, you overthrew or threw down. And so that is a word that may have these different translations. I referred to the NRSVUE and the NIV kind of to give different colorations so you can kind of see how this can be translated differently. But overthrew, threw down is similar to strewn down the enemies. Number 12, the enemies are destroyed easily like some kind of vegetation. In the Vedic version, it is the ritual grass. In the Exodus hymn, it is the stubble or straw that it refers to. So as I mentioned before, this is a keystone metaphor within the hymn. There are not that many metaphors in the Song of the Sea itself in the first place. This is, again, one of the most vivid and quote-unquote unique, and it happens to be specifically paralleled in the Vedic hymn. So the Vedic hymn reads, just as a wonderworker whets down, and that means to cut, with like a scythe. In any case, it means to cut the ritual grass, which is called kusha grass, on the seat. The champion Indra made a gush of them. So just like a wonder worker cuts the ritual grass on the seat, the champion Indra has made a gush of them, meaning destroyed them completely, obliterated them, obviously. So the enemies are described metaphorically as this kind of grass, and it's just being obliterated by Indra. In the Exodus hymn, we have, you sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble or straw. So that's this word kash, Q-A-S-H, and that can be translated as stubble, as in straw, or the chaff. So again, that is an uncannily similar image of this weak vegetation, grass versus straw-like substance being obliterated by the god. Number 13, God is specifically described metaphorically as wonderworker. And so this is not an entirely unique thing to call a god, and it appears multiple times in different Vedic hymns referring to different gods to call them a wonderworker. It's one of the stock kind of metaphors for the god, but it is also, again, not ubiquitous. It might appear in less than 10% of Rig Vedic hymns. And so when it appears in both of these hymns, after all these other alignments, it is very uncanny to see. So in the Vedic hymn, we have just as a wonderworker, as I just mentioned. And in the Exodus hymn, it says doing/working wonders. That is directed at God, of course. And I looked into the etymologies. I think the word is dasma in Sanskrit, and it just means wonderworker, working wonders. So this is a good translation, and it happens to appear in both of these. Number 14, thrust to the earth or swallowed by the earth, also enveloped by the earth. So there are these similar kind of swirl of descriptions that center around the earth swallowing or being enveloped by the earth, or them being thrust to the earth, which you can kind of compare here. So, quote, the mere half a hero who drinks the cooked oblation, without Indra who vaunts himself, did he thrust away to the ground, that is literally pritivim, to the earth. So he was thrust away to the earth. And Griffith translates that as Indra's denier, far o'er the earth he scattered. And then see also a different line, with his greatness, Indra or Turvasha enveloped the earth, being master of it. So it's hard to tell who the referent is there. And in the Exodus hymn, we have, you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. So the enemy is being thrust away to the earth or scattered across the earth in the Vedic version, while the god himself is enveloping the earth. And in the Exodus version, you just have the god stretching out his hand and causing the earth to swallow the enemy. Very similar, although, slight differences, but similar. Number 15. So this is where I said after the main unfolding of the plot elements and the main metaphors, after that, the second half or the latter third or whatever of the hymns are dedicated to a named list of defeated enemy tribes, one after another, how this god defeated these enemies. And in this section, it is specifically repeatedly highlighting the bond of that god with his chosen people of a sort, and also repeating the strength of his arm. This is the same combination of elements that just happen to be here in this section. And I think this is fascinating to look at as well, because we think of this hymn in Exodus, and in general within Exodus, this concept of the chosen people who are destined to inherit Canaan, and God has made it their destiny and chosen them for his people to have a special relationship with them. Well, we see that same thing in this Vedic hymn with slightly different wording. But as you will see, repeatedly in this hymn, the protagonist Vasishta is describing how his tribe, his people, have a special partnership or friendship with Indra. Not only that, but they're repeatedly making fun of, demeaning the opponents for being bad, for sacrificing wrongly to the god, for doing religion wrong, for doing sacrifice wrong, or even for doing speech wrong. This is like the concept of like a barbarian, the idea that the outsider has some kind of bad, he's not skilled with speech. But this has a deeper ritual, sacred dimension to it, especially in Vedic society, but elsewhere too, because speech itself is sacred. So if you accuse someone of having some negative quality attached to their speech, that is also criticizing their ritual efficacy, their ability to do the religion correctly, do sacrifice correctly and efficaciously. And, they are being shown to be, not having this special partnership with the god, which is undergirded by the proper worship that they do. We do the proper worship of Indra, therefore we are in this partnership with them. You others, you enemies, are incompetent with your sacred speech and your sacrifice. You are not in this partnership. So that is all here which is quite fascinating and gets directly kind of echoed into the Exodus hymn. So in the Vedic hymn, quote, "Then famous old Kavasha, he wrenched down into the waters, and Anu and Druhyu, he with the mace in his arms." He with the mace in his arms is Indra, of course. So this is, Indra is wrenching them down into the waters, rather. "The ones devoted to you," that's referring to themselves, the protagonists, the side of Vasishta, "the ones devoted to you, who cheered you," and they're talking to Indra, of course, "who cheered you on, were choosing your partnership or friendship for their partnership." And friendship is just a different translation, I think, from Griffith. "The ones devoted to you, us, who cheered you on, Indra, were choosing your partnership for their partnership. In an instant, Indra split open all the fortified places, their 7 strongholds, with his might. He shared out the patrimony of the descendant of Anu to Tritsu. We defeated the Puru of scornful speech." So that is, the Puru is the larger overtribe that they are fighting against, and they're saying that they have scornful speech. That is the negativized sacred speech that they have at the right of distribution. "The cow-seeking Anu and Druhyu people fell down to sleep." So again, it's reiterating their greed for plunder, for the cows that they wanted to plunder. "The cow-seeking Anu and Druhyu people fell down to sleep. 6,000 of them, because one after the other the rivals become subject to you. Procure the subjugation even of vaunting Veda. Whoever commits an offense against mortals who praise," so that's referring to themselves, again, as mortals who praise. We are the ones who praise correctly, that is. So whoever commits an offense against us, mortals who praise, smash your sharp mace down on him, O Indra. The Yamuna river helped Indra, as did the Tritsus. He despoiled Bheda there entirely, and the Ajas, Sigras, and the Yakshus brought horses' heads as tribute. Unquote. So again, it's this listed sequence of enemies that Indra has defeated, interspersed with this specific theme of their friendship with the god. In the Exodus version, the Exodus hymn famously switches over from the main plot to a listed set of enemies that the god has defeated. Quote, "You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love," that refers, of course, to like the friendship of Indra, as before. "In your steadfast love, you led the people whom you redeemed." Again, it's this theme of we are the ones you redeemed. We have been chosen by you in this specific way. "You guided them by your strength to your holy abode." Again, hitting that note of invoking his strength, just as in the Vedic version. "The peoples heard, they trembled." That is the enemy peoples, of course, they trembled. "Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm, they became still as a stone." You can see in the lines right next to it, Anu and Druhyu fell down to sleep. It's an incredibly similar metaphor. Became still as a stone versus fell down to sleep, happening right next to each other there in the sequence. "Until your people, O Lord, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by." So that just parallels so nicely the Vedic tribe who is in partnership with Indra. Okay, so next is coming to the conclusion of the hymn. Both hymns kind of culminate with this image of a mountain, and it is used similarly but also differently in both. But it is, the consistency here is that there is suddenly this image of the mountain. So the mountain motif, the god is helping the chosen ones to a destined kingdom in both cases. That is the Sarasvati region in the Vedic case versus Canaan for the Exodus case. And this is either done by cutting down the enemy who is on the destined mountain or setting up the chosen tribe on the symbolic mountain. So in one case, it refers to cutting down the enemy from the mountain, and in the other, in setting chosen group onto the symbolic mountain. So, quote, "You cut down Sambara from the lofty mountain." And that may or may not refer to a separate legendary event. I think it might, but anyways, it's inserted here as an act of Indra that he's done, which feeds into what's happening now in the hymn. Those from this house who reached elation in devotion to you, they did not neglect their partnership with you who provided for them. So you provided for them, as again, very similar to what we were just seeing with the Lord acquiring the people and protecting them. Yeah, so you provided for them. So now day bright dawns will dawn forth for the patrons, unquote. And then in the Exodus hymn, you brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your own possession, the place, O Lord, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, that your hands have established, unquote. Okay, so it's a general idea, but it's happening right here in about the same moment in both hymns, right before the end of the hymn. Number 17, the strong arm of the god, as I've already mentioned, but I just wanted to add that in here, that there is this mention of the strength of the god's arm specifically. So again, it's on its own, it's generic, but in place, it is specifically invoking his arm. So in the Vedic hymn, it says, he with the mace in his arms, that is referring to Indra. In the Exodus hymn, your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. Number 18, both hymns have an invocation of the immeasurableness or incomparableness of the deity. Once again, this is a somewhat generic thing for hymns to gods, but worth noting because, once again, it happens in this milieu, in this mix of other parallels. So in the Vedic version, we read, neither your favors nor your riches, O Indra, can be entirely surveyed. In the Exodus hymn, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? And so it's just this invocation of their immeasurableness in the Vedic hymn, incomparableness in the Exodus version. Can you be entirely surveyed? And then who is like you? Number 19, the concluding lines of both hymns invoke a similar concept. That is the unaging lordly power or eternal lordly reign. In the Vedic hymn, the final line says, quote, the aspiration of Paijavana, referring to Sudas, lordly power, difficult to attain and unaging, as he seeks your favor. The final line of the Exodus hymn is, the Lord will reign forever and ever. Okay, so it is unaging lordly power, of course, but it's attributed to the king in the Vedic version, whereas eternal reign attributed to the god in the Exodus version. Okay, so they end on a similar, though again, slightly different note. There are a few images that are more or less unique to Exodus 15, which are worth noting. The blast of his nostrils, or blowing with your wind, is how the god does this feat in Exodus 15, and that is not mentioned in the Vedic hymn that I can tell. I searched Indra hymns in general. He's a storm god, thunder god. Winds are associated with him as a god of storm, but there was one debatable mention that I found in a different hymn about him blowing, but it was also could be translated as a different word there. So this could be just an original image that was added in the Exodus version, or could just be drawn from the general storm milieu, or who knows. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea is what the Exodus hymn says at one point, and this is not really paralleled in the Vedic. Of course, there's a lot of descriptions of the waters doing this or that. At one point it says that Aditi is caused to abort or miscarry, and scholars don't really know what that means, whether that is referring to the waters having some kind of symbolic abortion, or if it's referring to Aditi as mother of the sun, and therefore the abortion refers to a mythic concept where one of her children is like a miscarriage, and it refers to an eclipse that could have happened, or like the dust being stirred up and covering the sun in some way. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea does not have a clear parallel. It could be just original language in the Exodus hymn. The floods standing up in a heap in the Exodus hymn versus just making a ford in the Vedic hymn. That is clearly slightly different. But again, if you begin with this concept of the waters receding, waters coming back, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how you could, if someone was adapting this, they could just describe it as the waters piling up in a heap, and that is how they want to describe the scene, to change that description very slightly in that way. From that, we get this image, of course, of the walls of water, because the word is sometimes translated as a heap and other times as a wall. Yeah, that's kind of our pop culture image of crossing of the Red Sea here, and that makes it seem slightly different or significantly different from what's happening in the Vedic version, because we don't have any walls of water. We just have waters that have been made fordable and then they collapse back down. But I think you can see here that it's a simple elaboration or even intensification. If one wanted to paint an even more dramatic picture of what's happening, they would just describe it as the floods piling up in a heap, and then that gets sort of shifted over to like a wall. There are then smaller differences like the stone versus the implied flotsam, or the stone versus the offering cake, the person becoming like an offering cake that's drowning. So those are slight differences in imagery. The dry ground versus the fordable ground. It's important to point out those differences, but in these hymns, there's a massive set of parallels within a small amount of text. And the fact that there are only really this handful of slight differences, I think, can be easily explained and supports the fact that this is a direct parallel despite these. So there is another hymn in the Rig Veda about the Battle of 10 Kings crossing, and it is Rig Veda 7.33. And there are potential even more parallels between that hymn, the second Battle of 10 Kings hymn, and Exodus 14. So Exodus 14 is, again, the description of what's happening that comes right before the Song of the Sea, leading up to it. And so let's just go through those real quick as well. So Rig Veda 7.33, this is about the same battle. We have Indra speaking directly here. Quote, Indra says, "Gladly, you superior men, by reason of your father's sacred formulation," or hymn, "I have engirdled the axle. You will certainly not be harmed, since with a lofty cry in Shakvari, that is martial meter, you established impetuous force in Indra, O Vasishtas." So the Vasishtas are the group, the tribe that Vasishta is part of, his family, his sons. "Like thirsty ones looking toward heaven for rain, in distress they looked toward Indra, when they were surrounded in the battle of the 10 kings. Indra hearkened to Vasishta as he was praising. He made the broad space broad for the Tritsus. They were cut off short, like goads for driving cattle, the puny Bharatas." And that is, again, Vasishta's side. He is with the Bharatas, but they are like puny, cut-off group. They are the smaller side. "When Vasishta came to be the leader, right after that did the clans of the Tritsus spread out," unquote. So that led them to victory, essentially. Exodus 14 says, "As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord." So it's this moment of them being pursued and crying out to their God in a way they've been cut off in some sense or chased down. "Moses answered the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today.' That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant," unquote. So both of these sections that I just quoted conclude with the sage being referred to as the one who has brought them through. So, as I said, when Vasishta came to be their leader, right after that did the clans of the Tritsus spread out. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. It's the same pattern here, and also them being cut off and then saved by Moses, them having a direct speech with their God. Okay, so I think those map very well together, and so it suggests again that even Exodus 14 material was being drawn from the Battle of 10 Kings hymn or hymns, plural. The summary of the main parallels, we've already gone through them, I think, enough, but there's a screenshot of that if you'd like to look. Most uncommon motifs, so there are some uncanny, uncommon things. The horse and the rider mentioned together. Easy destruction of the enemies compared to cutting ritual grass or burning straw. It's a very specific simile. And then also overhanging both of these hymns is this same motif of them, of this chosen group, this group that has a special partnership with the god, and how they are going to come to their destined land where they will make their kingdom. It's actually the same plot, is the same thing happening with King Sudas and his group and Vasishta. The Battle of Rig Veda 7.18 actually tells material from a couple of different battles, according to scholars. So the first half, describing the waters collapsing and all that, is from them fighting a battle on the Parushni River, entering from Pakistan into India, the subcontinent, and then the Saraswati, traditionally called the Saraswati area, and then establishing their kingdom there, where they kind of set up their base and eventually form the Kuru, not Puru, but Kuru kingdom. So it's like their promised land. And the second half of Rig Veda 7.18 talks about a battle that happens there further along, where they defeat further enemies and come to that destined land as we went through. So that means the functions of these hymns are equivalent. The function of each hymn as national epic, celebrating divine intervention and justifying the chosen people's victory and inheritance, is essentially identical. The Hebrews go from here to the promised land of Canaan, the future land of Israel, and the Bharatas, with Sudas and Vasishta, go from here to the promised land of northwest India / the future Kuru kingdom, where classical Vedic society develops. Vedic scholars like Michael Witzel see this hymn as one of the main foundations of the war described later in the national epic, the Mahabharata. So it is almost unheard of to find two hymnal texts from different civilizations with such a detailed point-by-point correspondence in both narrative sequence and poetic imagery too. Hymns are not generic to this degree of structure, order, and specific metaphors, but tend to have more unique structures to them and details, even when they share genre features or narrative mythemes. So when we think of comparative mythology, a lot of times we see two different stories that are similar, even very similar, and we're not going to immediately think one borrowed from the other, because there are shared generic motifs, there are shared roots that you can go farther back and look at. But with a hymn, like a piece of poetry or a song, it's like if I wrote a song called Nickel Street and I start listing a barbershop and a fireman and so all these things in a certain way, people would say that I copied that from Penny Lane. You know what I mean? So poems, hymns, songs, they have a much more density of linguistic details, with specific metaphors, like I pointed out, specific word orders, specific structure, the overall structure and how it develops an event, a motif in a certain order, like we went through. These similarities don't happen kind of accidentally. It would be unheard of for something like that. So it points to they had to have come from a shared source of some kind. And even the idea that they came from thousands of years prior from a shared source to this degree of structural and metaphorical similarity becomes more and more unlikely as well, so that it points more and more toward adaptation of one to the other. So I think I need to get that across, because people like to say this is, some like motifs that are generic about crossing a river, but that's not actually accurate. Even the core motif of these hymns of crossing a river, that is rather generic, and we find instances of this throughout the Rig Veda, just crossing a river. And also we find a couple instances in the Avesta, but we never anywhere else find crossing the river, the enemy pursuing greedily, then the waters also miraculously, coincidentally crashing back over the enemy pursuer. That combination, that sequence of things happening, I've never found to that degree of similarity. Yes, you can say there's a genre of crossing rivers and certain motifs, but not to this level. This is why I wanted to show this visually, that when you look at the visual, I'll just pull it up one more time here. So if we look at the visual of the hymns one more time, this degree of specificity, of structure. So a poem, a song, a hymn has a unique structure a lot of times. There can, of course, you can create a form that gets repeated, but it's very difficult to reinvent the exact same structure without knowing a hymn, for example, with the same types of motifs and metaphors happening in a similar same order. Okay, hope that gets across. But we can see that we have the intro material right at the beginning, then a sort of the development of the main plot motif in the green. In the yellow, we have the quotation of the pursuing enemies and them talking about plunder. In the green, some more elements of the main plot of the waters crashing back over. In the blue section is these two metaphorical elements of blasting the enemy like they are grass or straw, and that the god is like a wonder worker. And then the purple is that long list of enemy tribes killed one after another while invoking how they are in a partnership, or they have been chosen in some way by the god, and that we are the correct worshippers of the god. And then the concluding lines, of course, after some material at the bottom here, I think doesn't really parallel Exodus very well. So part of my entire argument is that certain things are being cut down, obviously, from the Vedic version that were not relevant to what the Exodus hymn wanted. So that was a pretty simple concept there. Let's go back. Yeah, okay. So the level of parallelism here is even more specific than what is usually found, for example, between the Hebrew Bible and Near Eastern myths. It's my opinion that this is significantly more of a linguistic side-by-side parallel smoking gun than what we find usually as sort of par for the course of comparisons to even Near Eastern myths. And even what is often seen as maybe one of the clearest sort of smoking guns that is sometimes used in the creation, tohu wa bohu, formless and void. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. There's this suggestion that this tohu wa bohu is this smoking gun. Well, what I'm suggesting here is this is significantly more elements here that are linguistically, structurally aligned in an uncanny way. Because of that, because of this line-by-line comparison that can be done with this many points and uncanny features and order of events structurally, as I said, that makes this essentially a unicorn outside of established direct adaptations. And so it could be the clearest smoking gun that we are likely to find regarding the source of the Song of the Sea, and maybe even across the Bible itself, I think. But yeah, this, I just have to reiterate, this finding a hymn that looks like another hymn to this degree is kind of like a unicorn in comparative mythology, okay? And it would be even more so of a unicorn if we were to say that there is no connection between them, that they miraculously wrote these two hymns without knowledge of each other at all, or any shared source. That would be even more incredible to believe. So the number and specificity of the parallels, in my opinion, make independent composition essentially impossible to defend on probabilistic grounds. When you have this many specific correspondences in this precise of an order, you're not dealing with coincidence anymore, and the burden of proof shifts entirely to explaining how the direct connection occurred, not whether one exists. And so, interestingly, even scholar Joel Baden's comments on the Song of the Sea in terms of the documentary hypothesis. So Joel Baden, of course, is one of the most respected current documentary hypothesis or neo-documentary hypothesis scholars. And he has a Twitter thread where he goes through all of the verses of the Hebrew Bible. And he has pointed out that there are a couple strange features about the Song of the Sea. One of them is that he thinks the descriptions and the invocations in the Song of the Sea point to the fact that this hymn was never originally part of a escape from Egypt story, and that it originally was attached to some event that was a battle in water, and that it has been taken out of its context, its original context, and placed into this narrative that was being written about slaves escaping from Egypt. Okay, so there are indications to him independently that this has been ripped out of its original context, and he says the original context was a battle in a body of water. That's literally what I'm saying happened with this hymn. The original context is only explained by the Vedic, what is called the most famous historical event of the Rig Veda, and has a much more clear context that it corresponds to in the Veda. So he says, quote, "The battle scene in the first part of the poem was not originally about the Exodus, or the event described in prose in Exodus 14. It is a hymn to Yahweh's military victory at a body of water. Egypt is mentioned only in 14 verse 4. There is no other context related to the Exodus. You couldn't come close to reconstructing the narrative context or content of Exodus 14 from this song. It's only because we have the prose first that we assume the song is describing that event. In fact, it's probably quite the opposite. That is, the idea that they had the hymn first, taken out of its context, and then they wrote the prose intro in Exodus 14 to tie it into the narrative they were constructing secondarily. I think it more likely that the prose accounts are building off the song, creating an Exodus event on the basis of this hymn. J in particular looks to follow the song pretty well, but P has some connections too. So yeah, he reads Exodus 14 as being kind of a couple of authors telling sort of slightly different versions of this lead up to the event of the song, and that the author or the document J is more closely in alignment with what the song itself says. And I again pointed out some details where even Exodus 14 seems to be drawing from the two Rig Veda Battle of 10 Kings hymns. So the point is, for Baden, the independent song wasn't about Israel's escape from slavery in Egypt any more than the song in Genesis 49 was about Jacob's deathbed blessing of his sons. Those are the contexts in which the independent songs have been set." Unquote. And then, interestingly, the other weird feature that he can't quite explain or that stands out to him is that Exodus seems to be split into these two sections, where the first section is about the Egyptians being drowned when the waters collapse over them. But it suddenly and abruptly shifts to this list of battle victories over enemies. And that's exactly what happens in the Rig Veda hymn that I pointed out. And not only that, but scholars believe that the Vedic hymn is that way because the second half of the hymn is describing a separate battle, the later battle when they're closer to their final destination, where they set up their kingdom, and that is the Yamuna River. So it mentions the Parushni River is the first half, and then the second half of the Rig Vedic hymn is about the Yamuna River and multiple other tribes and enemies that they kill, that they defeat in sequence there. So that structure carried over into the Exodus hymn, but it stands out as not making a ton of sense to scholars like Joel Baden. Even it's still there. There's a reason for it existing in the Vedic hymn, but it's just there in the Exodus hymn. It doesn't have a clear reason why these two parts would be joined together in this hymn. So Baden says, quote, "Regardless of age, the song comes in two major sections, the battle scene in 1 through 12 and the guidance scene in 13 through 17. Some argue that these were originally separate poems since the content shifts so dramatically," unquote. And that break is quite literally there in the Vedic hymn because it is telling of two separate battles. And so the context shifts. Yeah, it has a clear and coherent explanation in the Vedic sense, tying into the history that's being told about. But in the Exodus version, it no longer has a clear explanation. That is a hallmark of borrowing, of direct borrowing. It's similar to a blind motif, but not quite the same. But it has the same kind of concept where something in the source text, it had a reason to be. It made sense, whereas that gets carried over into the adapted text, and it no longer, you at least don't know why it's there anymore. Why are there these two sections? It doesn't have a clear basis anymore, so that it's so striking that some scholars think it was two poems originally. Okay, so I hope that point gets across. So when could the Vedas have been written down? Okay, I'll go into that maybe at the end. We can go into the question of, does this have to be direct borrowing for this to make any sense at all? I just mentioned a reason why it should be considered a probable direct borrowing, and I mentioned multiple throughout there, I think. One of them being the fact that this is based on a sort of historical happenstance, what is seen as a historical event in the Rig Veda, but you never know if that's historical or not, right? But nonetheless, it's embedded in a complex web of historical quote-unquote details in the Rig Veda, such as the fact that Vishvamitra is one of the actual traditional authors of Book 3, and he's praising King Sudas, the same king, throughout that book in different places. And then Book 7, Vasishta, has taken over that job as the priest of Sudas, and they are breaking away against their overtribe, against the 10 kings. So that is embedded in this thing that you can see playing out in the authorship of the hymns itself, and why these hymns have been authored in the first place. So it has these sort of reasons why they are there and why this is happening that at least Michael Witzel believes has a historical basis. Jameson and Brereton, Jameson says that, again, she's rather agnostic about whether this is historical or 100% historical in the Vedic case, but she also doesn't say that it's not for sure. But again, there are reasons to think that there was some kind of kernel to it. The other interesting point is there's nothing excessively supernatural about what happens in the Vedic case, so it can easily have happened and then been attributed to the god secondarily. Like You would see the collapse. You'd be praising your god throughout the battle, and then miraculously to your eyes, the waters are diverted or collapse and drown your enemy. Now, nothing that breaks the laws of physics, let's say, has happened there. Quite the contrary. It could happen in any given battle if you're fighting in the middle of a river. But that is then directly attributed to your god, of course, because you've been praying to your god and he helped you through nature, through the river. And so when we look at this and ask whether it's historical, there's nothing, there's something that is unique about it and even unlikely, but it doesn't require a supernatural mythical explanation. And it has these other moving parts that reflect in other mundane parts of the Rig Veda. And in the Exodus version, it is now turned into, the walls of water the god is directly blowing on, and it's an entire sea rather than a river. So it's become something that seems to be breaking the laws of physics. Those are reasons to look at them. It's not exactly apples to apples to look at the historicity of each set of events and data points. Okay, so the other thing that is crucial to touch on here is this concept of the newness of Rig Veda hymns. And it is really an ideology of newness that existed for the Vedic poets. So the question we should be asking here is it possible that Vasishta, whoever composed under the name of Vasishta in the Rig Veda, is it possible that he just inherited a pre-existing song, like a specific, very detailed song with all these same details that I mentioned? Could he have inherited that from an Indo-Iranic, from an Indo-Aryan earlier time period that was just passed down to him, and it's an older song that then was inherited also by Israelites or could connect to them in some way, right? Is there a way that they had a common source rather than a direct borrowing from the text? And so to envision that, you would have to picture this hymn having all those shared points in very great detail, going back to whatever point you hypothesize. Let's say 1800 or 2000 BC, Indo-Iranic shared source or Indo-Aryan shared source feeding into the Mitanni or something a little bit later, 1700 BC. And so you have to picture this full song already existing, then being inherited by Vasishta, and he employs it and he gives it or him or his descendants. So this song is probably, they believe it's composed by the grandson or great-grandsons of Vasishta once they've arrived at their final destination, of course, looking back and potentially using material from the time itself, but it's a looking back hymn by basically the great-grandsons. In any case, Witzel, for example, Michael Witzel believes that this Battle of the Ten Kings happened around 1350 BC, give or take, a pretty broad, loose amount of time. And then if it was composed by his great-grandsons, that's another 100 years, give or take. So we're looking at, 1250 BC. It may have been composed in its final version, and that could have incorporated earlier material about that first battle combined with material about the second battle, or just composed at that later time. So let's just say, 1250 BC, and let's say 1700 or 1800, there was an original version in detail composed in a different context by the parent grouping. And then it was inherited by Vasishta and inherited by the ancestors of the Israelites, or what have you, got to the Israelites in however way you want to envision it. If this was the case, it would mean that Vasishta was just re-employing almost to a very close degree, including repeating metaphors from hundreds of years before. It's really an old song that he's employing, even though it's this crucial, quote-unquote, historical event in the Rig Veda that seems to be at the foundation of the Kuru kingdom. And you can see the change of the rishis, the change of the poets of Sudas. You can see that playing out in the authors of the books of the Rig Veda itself, all of that. But that would mean that he felt it was fine, or for whatever reason, he used an old song for this important occasion. Whoever was putting this together wanted to employ an old song for propagandistic purposes, for kingship building, whatever the case may be. But one important counterpoint to this is understanding what we see, actually, what is evidenced in the Rig Veda as a whole. And what we see is that there is very heavily this ideology that the composition of Vedic hymns by these poets was based on these hymns having to be new compositions. And not only that, but they had to, yes, they could use, and they did use, and they were supposed to use old mythic motifs, mythic events, but they had to recast them into new poetry. So the poetry had to be new, but the religious material was being brought to life again in new songs. This is repeated many times throughout the Rig Veda, that these have to be new songs, that this is a new song. And not only that, but we have 1028 hymns in the Rig Veda with none of them repeating. And even individual lines are very rare to see repeated. There's a couple moments where a line repeats a same line from a different hymn, right? Or the same line slightly differently changed. And so I think that this was so important that scholars point out that this was at the core of their religious belief. The newness of the hymn is one of the things that caused their rituals to work, to be efficacious. Okay, so if you didn't compose a brand new hymn, it would not compel the deity to listen to you. It would not be a valid, valuable gift to the deity. It would not bring them to give you gifts in response. So it would not make the sacrifice work if you used an old hymn. It had to be new. It had to have new metaphors, new structures, new lines, and had to be cast in a new way. So scholars go into why this is the case a little bit. And I should point out, along with this, the newness of the hymn is repeated verbatim, like directly, in several hymns in the Rig Veda, okay, including the one we're talking about. So in Rig Veda 7.18 that we're talking about, the Battle of 10 Kings hymn, he directly says that he has the newer speech, and that is referring to sacred speech specifically. He's talking about the opponent priest cursing and boasting at the waters, and cursing at us of the newer speech. So it's him, the priest Vasishta, versus the other priest, and he's saying we have the newer speech, and that is invoking this concept that I mentioned. That is in this hymn. So if he's invoking having the newer speech, and he's reusing a hundreds of year old song, that would be some kind of violation. That would be very within the ideology that we see at play in the Rig Veda. It would make no sense. It would be counter efficacious, all of that stuff. So one more from the Rig Veda, an example of this quote. This is from a hymn itself. During your sacrifices, may the poets who desire the gods praise heaven and earth with homage, so that they come, their best poetic formulae, never similar, and that is a word meaning incomparable or unlike. Never similar. That means the formulae must be new in the new hymns. Never similar to each other. Excited by inspiration, go apart in all directions like the branches of a tree, unquote. That's from Rig Veda, book 7. Once again, from Vasishta's book itself. Vasishta clan wrote that hymn as well. So the scholars say, this is from Alexis Pinchard, quote, here the diversity of songs, the difference in the songs, is very positively valued and takes over a cosmic dimension. This diversity is necessary to the achievement of sacrifice, unquote. And then, quote, these speeches impulsed the nourishing primeval waters upwards or were identified with them. The gods needed such a help from the men because they were quite weak. So it somehow gives strength to the gods. The gods sucked the sap of the sacrifice in order to make their lives longer, unquote. That's from Pinchard, Roots and Branches of the Veda as an Inverted Tree. We see it again, Rig Veda, book 7, hymn 26. Once again, Vasishta's own book in the Veda. Quote, Soma unpressed does not exhilarate Indra, nor do pressings unaccompanied by sacred formulations exhilarate the bounteous one. For him I beget a hymn that he will enjoy, a newer, manly one, so that he will listen to us, unquote. So having a new hymn, a newer hymn, makes the god listen to the poet in the first place and makes the sacrifice work. Witzel says, quote, on the one hand, Rig Vedic formulaic language is generally not manifested as large blocks of identical text. Instead, strict formulae, that is, identically repeated phrases, tend to be brief, considerably shorter than a verse line. In addition, many formulae do not involve exact repetition, but exist as quote-unquote deep structure with multiple variations on the deep structure showing up on the surface. Repeated full verse lines are fairly rare in the Rig Veda. See Bloomfield for those that exist. But patterned alternates of underlying formulae are pervasive in the text. The prime example of a short, strict, repeated formulae is the encapsulation of the great Indra myth, in which he kills the archenemy, the snake of Vritra. This deed is succinctly summarized by the phonologically driven two-word formulae Ahan Ahim, he or you smote the serpent, which occurs numerous times in the text. But such exact repeated phrases are relatively rare, and even this particular formula is regularly subject to variation by inter alia morphological manipulation, like when smiting the serpent, or with a participle ganan substituting for the finite verb ahan. Elaboration of one or the other of the terms, such as he smote him, the firstborn of the serpents, or lexical substitution, he smote Vritra, where a form of the root vad, which is suppletive to han, supplies the verb and the name of the enemy, beginning with v, replaces ahim, serpent, but reestablishes the alliterative pattern of the original formula. In the standard model of oral composition, the poem itself is ever-changing and is the joint or rather successive product of a series of anonymous bards, with fixation of the text, if it comes at all, coming much later. Poets often refer to themselves by name within their compositions, proudly asserting that the hymn is their product. Though they make use of formulaic language, they aim to put their personal stamp on that language, often by the types of variation just described, and to make each composition distinctively their own. They painstakingly acquire the tools and skills that belong to the oral tradition, but also explicitly aim to put those tools and skills to new uses. There is always tension between the weight of the tradition and the pressure for novelty. As one poet puts it in Rig Veda 3.31.10, quote, I make new the song born of old, unquote, acknowledging both the legacy of his poetic forebears and his own contribution in creating something original, unquote. Witzel explains the significance of the term shraddha, meaning to place the heart in or on, and cognate to Latin credo, often misleadingly translated as faith, originally referred to confidence in the efficacy of the ritual, i.e. its ability to motivate the counter gifts from the gods, and also connecting this to, quote, the release of divine inspiration to latter-day poets who want to compose a new song, that is Brahman, or a sorcery spell, and who want to make truth work. So it has to make truth work, satya kriya, unquote. The extraordinary power and prestige accorded to verbal behavior is another important aspect of Vedic thought that is visible from the earliest times. The very existence of the Rig Veda is a tribute to this notion. The multitude of elaborate hymns directed to the same divinity, composed by a variety of bardic families, results from the belief that the gods were most pleased by the newest hymn. As the text often tells us, the gods of early Vedic were not the mere dutiful receivers of a set liturgy that they became in the Middle Vedic period, but as guests at their solemn ritual reception on the offering ground, critical connoisseurs of poetic craftsmanship and virtuosity, just as the modern Hindu gods savor the stutis and stotras addressed to them in puja and other rituals. The better the hymn, the greater the reward to the poet from the patron, to the latter from the god. But what is most prized is not elegant verbal trickery, but rather the putting into words of a cosmic truth, unquote. So again, truth. And again, I think saying this is a new hymn and it not being a new hymn, I think that would also go against this idea of truth that the hymns are supposed to embody, at least ideologically. The other key point here is not only does a hymn have to be a new composition, poetically speaking, for it to have ritual efficacy in the first place, but it also has to be a new hymn in order to effectively, successfully praise the patron. So poets are competing for patronage of the kings, of whoever the patron is. And we can quite literally see that one poet lost his job, Vishvamitra, in book 3 of the Rig Veda, to this poet that we are talking about, Vasishta. He's the one composing this hymn. And if you come out with an old song that everybody knows and you're saying it is new, and you are violating this ideology of the newness of the song, poetically speaking, to be efficacious at ritual, it also would embarrass the patron that has patronized you. You are in competition for this job. So part of that is to praise, not only praise the god anew, but also to praise and honor the patron who is paying you with his gifts. And to even win that job, just reusing an old hymn seems, again, counterintuitive. It seems like something pushing against that possibility that is what, looking back at Vasishta by his great-grandsons, as I mentioned. But nonetheless, the same concept applies. They don't want to embarrass their patron. They want to give a gift of a new poetic composition. That is how they keep their job, and that is how the patron gets his reward of the praise. That is how the god gets his reward of the praise, and the sacrificer gets their counter gift from the god at all. All these things rely on the newness and the virtuosity of the poetic aspect of the hymn. So you can't just repeat the same exact structure with the same set of metaphors, word combinations being that close. There's a certain latitude to that and how things can be recombined. But it strikes me as unlikely, because you can see, again, we have 1,028 examples of Rig Vedic hymns, and that would be an anomaly, to say the least, in this specific hymn, because we don't see things repeated to this degree. Michael Witzel says, quote, philological examination of the Rig Vedic passages seems especially to support the view of Tim that Brahman refers originally to a formulation, the capturing in words of a significant and non-self-evident truth. The ability to formulate such truths gives the formulator special powers and can be exercised even in cosmic forces. This power attributed to a correctly stated truth is found in the later Satya Kriya, or act of truth, which is in fact already found in the Rig Veda and has counterparts in other Indo-European cultures. So again, yeah, there is some aspect where you have to wonder if they're going to violate this goal of the words being an act of truth to this degree, if that is heavily part of the sacrificial ideology itself, which they believe they're going to get something from these sacrifices. So the gods are watching them, and so are the patrons. And then Jameson and Burton say, quote, Rig Vedic poets understood their hymns to be new and creative formulations of truths about the cosmos and about the gods, and they held that these formulations and the accompanying rituals could make real, at the place and time of the sacrifice, the powers that govern human life and the world, unquote. Okay, so this is an argument for the idea that whether the event of the Battle of 10 Kings is 100% historical, it doesn't have to be, okay? It could be legendary retelling of a known event of some kind by the great-grandsons, as I said. But even then, the point is, even if it's only partly historical, there's a kernel of history, or it's completely legendary, even if it was completely made up as a legend, this specific structure of the hymn, I'm arguing, was composed in the Vedic period by Rig Vedic poets because of this ideology of the newness of the song, the poet announcing the newness in the hymn itself, and the fact that we have evidence that they were consistent about this across 1,000 hymns of the Rig Veda. And not only that, but it tied into how they believed sacrifice to even work. It wouldn't work without this. So it's not just a passing claim that this is new, that, we have in the Psalms, I sing to you a new song to God, but it is not tied to ritual efficacy. It is just, at least in that context, that we know of, and there's like 10% as many psalms, and it is not a repeated motif and ideology as we see it in the Vedic corpus. So it's sort of apples to oranges in that context. That addresses why I think the composition of this hymn in the Rig Vedic period should be taken seriously. If it was composed in the Rig Vedic period, then this adaptation to the Exodus had to have come downstream of the Rig Veda rather than from the Mitanni, which is an earlier breakoff, or from a different source like that. This obviously, also I should say, this doesn't prove that 100%. These are points, these are reasons to take seriously that this is what may have happened, okay? And I think it seems to me that a lot of times people will just throw out possibilities without understanding the factors like this that push against those possibilities, without understanding how in depth the amount of correspondence is in this parallel or others. And so without seeing that full picture, you can't weigh the possibilities as accurately. The other thing about, say, a Mitanni source. So the Mitanni broke off from the Indo-Aryans. Well, if they broke off from the Indo-Aryans, then it happened before this point, before the Rig Vedic society, according to scholar Michael Witzel's interpretation, that the Indo-Aryans were a group and the Rig Vedic Indians came from that group and moved into India. And so the Rig Vedics are descendants of Indo-Aryan. They are an extension of Indo-Aryans. And the Mitanni was a group that went the other direction and influenced somehow this Hurrian kingdom of the Mitanni, called Mitanni. But I've already given some reasons why that seems unlikely just from the text itself and the ideology of the poets. But I think it also needs to be emphasized that this Mitanni concept is not as robust and solid. It is unclear if the Mitanni was even a population presence at all in the Hurrians, in the Hurrian society that became the Mitanni. Meaning, it is unclear if the Indo-Aryans themselves were there in person as the first kings, as ancestors. There is even Michael Witzel, he's very in-depth on this kind of stuff, as you can see. He painstakingly maps out the Rig Vedic poets and the historical chronology in the Rig Veda and how this all happened, how when they are crossing this or that river, it shows a certain chronology and them moving down into their ultimate Kuru kingdom. So he is intensely into the details on this. Even he is agnostic about whether the Indo-Aryans were there in person as ancestors in the Mitanni kingdom, kings in the Mitanni kingdom, a ruling elite, as it is said. Even he says they could have been, or it could have been that the early Hurrian Mitanni people were just in close contact with them and were influenced culturally as a secondary. The Mitannis copied a certain set of chariot-related terminology and honored a certain set of deities that they were influenced secondarily. Eva von Dassau is a scholar who I recommend reading what she has to say. She has written on this issue saying, let me just pull this up for 1 second. So this is from Eva von Dassau, EVA. Quote, "The kingdom called Mitanni was not the creation of an Aryan population newly arrived in southwestern Asia. A tiny quantity of Indo-Aryan vocabulary and proper nouns became incorporated into the Hurrian language of Mitanni, while also spreading among realms with which Mitanni interacted over the course of the empire's fluidity. Apparently, no one in Mitanni spoke the Indo-Aryan source language, for the borrowed lexical items were unproductive in the borrowing language. There is no Indo-Aryan grammatical interference therein." And so I think that's one of the key arguments she makes, that there's no imprint or even grammatical interference with anything we see in the Hurrian language from Indo-Aryan. So it looks like the characteristics of what you see with borrowing in that sense. And no other extant evidence indicates that the donor language had ever been the living cultural property of any part of the kingdom's population. The scant Indo-Aryan linguistic material does not attest the presence, much less the dominance, of an Indo-Aryan speaking population. Instead, the kingdom's identity was Hurrian, as attested by numerous references to the king of Mitanni as king of Hurriland, or king of Hurrian troops, not the king of Aryan troops or the like, while the practice of bestowing throne names of Indo-Aryan derivation, which we do see on most of Mitanni's kings, suggests significant contact with an Indo-Aryan speaking population. It does not indicate that the royal dynasty, much less the ruling class, was of Aryan blood, whatever that might mean. Mitanni's success did not result from the innovation of using horse-drawn chariots in war, or in any case, this innovation did not belong to Mitanni. The development of chariotry was shared by the kingdom's contemporaries and opponents, and the evidence does not suggest that it originated among the polities or peoples antecedent to Mitanni. Though military success must have been essential to the foundation and growth of Mitanni, military innovation was not. Hence, no special role can be attributed to the social class associated with chariotry, and denoted by the Hurrianized Indo-Aryan word Mariani. The formation of this class was moreover posterior to the formation of Mitanni. It was not a cause of the empire's creation, but an effect thereof. To fill in the information vacuum by positing an invasion of chariot-riding Aryans or the like is an exercise in pseudo-historical wish fulfillment, not historical explanation. Incidentally, no more can the rise of Mitanni be accounted for by the expansion and dominance of Hurrians, or Hurrian-speaking people, than by the imaginary Indo-Aryan takeover. The mode of explanation whereby historical change is supposed to result from movements of peoples remains as popular as it is simplistic. People do move, but seldom in such movements. The predominant factor is in causing historical change. The like can be said of attributing a causal role to the introduction of new military technology. In the case at hand, explanation of these types are neither supported by the evidence nor do they provide a plausible or sufficient account of it. While invoking a deus ex machina like a spurious population influx is not a valid historical method, the work of history does require going beyond merely accumulating and paraphrasing evidence that bears on the problem at issue. Okay, so what is interesting is that we have so little sign of Indo-Aryan presence in this society that scholars can say things like this. The Mitanni practiced Hurrian religion. We have evidence of this. When Egyptians sent letters to them, they responded, in the Hurrian language. We have just a few lexical items in the famous treaty document where 5 or 6 Rig Vedic gods are, Indo-Aryan gods are invoked. They are given, a couple of them are given, Hurrianized names. Like there is a suffix that shows that they are being affected by the Hurrian language itself rather than the other way around. And it is in a list with a whole bunch of other Hurrian deities. The point is, even if there was a presence, again, Michael Witzel is agnostic, he could go either way, but even if there was a presence of Indo-Aryans in the Mitanni at the beginning, and let's say the first king, they became absorbed. So, and again, Eva von Dassau says there's no evidence of that. There's no actual imprint other than the lexical points that can be caused by borrowing. Even if they existed as a population, the point is they became so absorbed and they just were Hurrians. Seemingly the only evidence we have is of the Mitanni kingdom practicing Hurrian religion. And not only that means they would have been so small and military elites that how would they be a priestly group that could preserve a massive set of religious texts and documents to have this borrowing? So I'm taking the agnostic stance as well, but just to point out that people really are casting a deus ex machina, I think, when they point to this, because unless we can get more evidence that there was a population that was capable of preserving a religion so fully intactly to account for the broad, extensive set of parallels that I've laid out, not only the one in this video today that is extremely detailed, but all of the ones from Abraham to Isaac and Jacob and Moses across the entire stretch is all borrowed from some kind of Indo-Aryan or Vedic source. So this tiny ruling elite of Indo-Aryans that were clearly just a warrior band as we picture them, they would have had to, despite apparently assimilated into Hurrian society, if they existed at all, they clearly left no evidence of themselves, and they would have had to preserve this extensive religion with all its precise details. That is what a priest caste does. That is the only reason that extensive mythology exists intact for the Vedics, is because they had one of the most elaborate, extensive, and well-preserved priest castes with multiple categories of priest and complex rituals that those myths are encoding. And that required Vedic society for that to exist at all. We're now trying to posit that this drop in the ocean that the Mitanni may have represented somehow preserved that same complexity of religious material without leaving any mark or any sign of its existence. You have to realize that I think that without more evidence, you're following sort of a fantasy of some lost tribe, some lost remnant of a tiny group preserving elaborate things over many centuries, this set of material being preserved exactly into the Vedic material, despite the ideology of newness, that you're going against that, and then also being preserved down through and absorbed vanished group of Indo-Aryans in Mitanni, and that somehow being preserved all the way down to when the Bible is composed for hundreds, if not 1,000+ years on that side as well. And there are many more reasons that I can go into why, for example, the 3 men of Genesis who greet Abraham, that appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana, and it is the reason there are 3, why it's a triple god, is because it's reflecting the 3 Vedas, and that 3 Vedas only developed in Vedic society because of the 3 types of ritual speech unique to Vedic society. Anyways, there are multiple reasons why these kinds of theories can only kind of, I think, exist if you don't have the full picture of how extensive the set of parallels are. Also, it becomes kind of just a black box, a mystery box that you can throw. Something like Mitanni becomes sort of like anything could happen, and that is true. I agree. I will stand for the fact that anything could happen, but positing a ghost tradition of this complexity, surviving with a tiny tribe or group of tribes that left absolutely zero evidence of its existence over many centuries, and then emerging in the Bible, that is much more in the realm of fantasy compared to the idea that the composers of the Bible, of Exodus, had physical copies, a ghost copy of Indian texts coming to the Library of Alexandria within a small span of years, much more believable than many centuries of a ghost tradition with no actual evidence of its origin point, or that it left any trace of existing as, what kind of complex priesthood preserved this. All those things are things that have to be taken into account, have to be taken seriously. And that same argument has to apply for any kind of other theory, such as this mythology just existing anciently from an unknown source. You're now positing something with zero evidence of any kind, and we have evidence of what the mythologies and religions practiced in the area were in many cases. Not in all cases, but of course, in many cases, the Babylonian mythology and different Mesopotamian, Sumerian mythology. None of these match the material I've pointed to as closely as the Vedic material does. None of these specific parallels, you can look at the sacrifice of Daksha having a parallel in the story of Nergal and Ereshkigal and that sacrifice, but the Exodus version of that story and the Vedic version are closer together than any of those other Mesopotamian versions are to them. They cluster together, which is shocking. So that's why I leave everything open. I leave every possibility open. I want to put what is the strongest current evidence out there. And that's a challenge for if there's any more evidence that can be drawn for a different source, you need to have a starting point of evidence to go against these other factors that I've pointed out. To me, it would be just as fascinating to find that this was some anciently preserved tradition from a ghost unknown Mesopotamian origin, or from the Zagros Mountains, from whatever, the Indus Valley people, whatever you want to theorize. But you also have to realize when those are just guesses based on no evidence, when you're kind of stepping into a bigger fantasy versus less of a fantasy, which is just that some texts were traded and borrowed over to the Library of Alexandria at that point and were being directly copied, which other features of the adaptation point to, which I can go into, at a future point, and I've touched on already. But that argument can apply to, any sort of competing hypothesis, like the Kassites. The Kassites were similar thing where they're kind of unknown origin, kind of their language is treated as an unknown language isolate, I believe, and they became emperors of Babylonia, but they immediately integrated into Babylonian society, language, and religion. There are remnants of their pantheon, but there's nothing even in that to suggest that it's as close to the biblical material as the Vedic is. So again, there's nothing that I've seen that actually makes those more plausible. And you're once again positing, just always question yourself, if you are positing many, many centuries of this perfect preservation with no evidence of even a beginning point of that branch existing and how it might have continued on. So So yeah, that is what I believe. So. I have to wrap up now. And there's so much more I could say. There was so much more even that I wanted to talk about, and I hope I'll do another stream going into more points. I did hit on the main points though, which is that this would be explained by direct use of text. I want to get across that the order of the structure of these two hymns, it's in essentially the same order and details. I was just reading Gmurkin's article, Can the Documentary Hypothesis Be Rehabilitated?, which I recommend to anybody. It gives a model of how using texts at Library of Alexandria in 270 BC, there could have been a complex composition that happened, which resulted in the sort of documentary milieu, the documentary hypothesis. It could be a way of working with the documentary hypothesis to show how it was composed, even in a concentrated composition event. So yeah, rest in peace to Gmurkin, definitely. So I recommend his work. I'm sure you guys all probably have heard of it. With the historicity of the Vedas, we have here, when could the Vedas have been written down? The language of the Vedic civilization in India was Vedic Sanskrit, which remains extant today in the texts of the Vedas. These texts were first composed about 1500 BCE, codified about 900 years later, and written down probably after 300 BCE, unquote. That's from Barbara West, Encyclopedia of Peoples of Asia. And this is a sort of, scholars don't often want to even talk about when this could have happened. But the fact of the matter is, writing bursts onto the scene in India in the 200s with like the Ashoka inscriptions of the 260s BCE, but those show a complex, precise written language that many scholars think probably had precedence. It didn't just burst out of nothing, so it probably existed there in that window of time during the Mauryan Empire, or right prior to it in the 400s perhaps, or rather 4th century, the 300s. So yeah, this window aligns perfectly of when India was getting writing and when definite signs of it were appearing. But they were writing on palm leaves and birk bark. The majority of writing at this time would have disintegrated and left no trace. The reason we have Ashoka's edicts from the 260s and thereon is because it's written on stone by the emperor, and so it's this massive thing. So point is, scholars believe writing very well could have existed. There are signs of it. I can't go into it right now. I wanted to go more into that topic, so maybe we'll save that for the future. And thank you guys for listening. Yeah, there was the Alexander just opened the floodgates in at the end of the 320s to India, and there's known contacts between India and Alexandria, and in India and the West in general, because of Alexander and what he opened up with that. So I think there was clearly trade, and it is not a fantasy to think that texts were traded at that point at all. Okay, I want to talk so much more about this, so thank you guys for your time. Have a good day.